welcome on behalf of the BIC for this program with Barbara Haering, whose wonderful and many achievements you see on the website. So I'm not going to list them or we'll take up the whole time. And which is in collaboration with Swissnex and the Swiss Consulate here in Bangalore. So thank you, Jonas. I just want to give you a very brief little window into how I know Barbara, or maybe not quite how I know Barbara, but just to say that I'm so happy that Barbara and her husband Jacques are here. Welcome them to Bangalore, which is at its dusty, hot best, but all the jacarandas, the few that are left, are in bloom, and everything is so wonderful and green, and so it's lovely having you here. Thank you. I also want to say that Barbara, you may not know, but Barbara has a long and deep connection to India. Her parents first met in India 70-something years ago and were married in Mumbai. And the first time Barbara came to visit me in Bombay, she had this tiny little photograph. You know, in those days, of course, people would want to have very small pictures because nobody made large ones. This tiny photograph of where her parents used to live, and we embarked on this complex research project on where that building was. And then thanks to Neeta Premchand, we figured out where it was, and it's on Colaba Causeway near Café Leopold. And there we were in the middle of the causeway, of this profound, moving moment, looking at where Barbara's parents had lived and started their lives together. So Barbara has this deep connection with India, which I think is continuing in different ways. And so welcome. I will, as I said, not read out her bio. You can look it up on the website. And I'll now invite Jonas, who's Jonas Brunswig, the Swiss Consul General and the Director of Swissnex, to tell you about the connections. Thank you.
Good evening, everyone. Pleasure to be here. I'm really delighted that Indira makes my job as a CEO of Swissnex in India and the Consul General of Switzerland to South India, excuse me, so easy. Our job, in a nutshell, is to engineer serendipity, and Swissnex is a beautiful anomaly in the world of diplomacy because it is the Science and Technology Consulate of Switzerland. You see me here wearing the head of Consul General, but I am not a traditional career diplomat. I'm not a traditional person with a background as you would have most of my peers here in Bangalore. But really, our mission and our vision is to accelerate positive transformations at the frontiers of knowledge. And of course, bringing Switzerland, India, and to a certain extent, the world together so that we can make some positive contributions at these frontiers of knowledge. And for us, it is particularly exciting this year to have this serendipitous and unexpected visit of Barbara Haering, whom I don't know yet, but I know of her. And I know that she has been intimately involved under the hood in what I would call the operating system of the infinite loop between science and democracy that we are about to hear more from. And Switzerland it's a very successful country in many ways, and it's a very contradictory country in many others. And I feel like I live and embody that contradiction through the organization Swissnex that I represent here, because I often think that it's a beautiful anomaly that something like Swissnex is even allowed to exist in the first place when confronted with some of the realities and the status quo of Switzerland, which is not often very innovative, I have to say. And we had a little exchange with Barbara Haering before this talk on higher education in Switzerland, for example, where she is intimately familiar and involved and has a lot to do with this infinite loop. It's a sector that is very comfortable. And I just want to give a quick quote from the president of Northeastern University in Boston, Joseph Aoun, who in a book, Higher Education in the Age of AI, wrote that higher education is in the business of changing the world, but it doesn't want to change itself. And I think this ties very strongly and very neatly into this idea of the infinite loop and science and democracy. Science happens to a large extent in the research laboratories of universities and research institutions. And so I am eager and excited to hear and to learn from someone so esteemed and accomplished who has contributed in so many ways and from so many different facets, whether it is working directly with the universities, whether it was working as a member of parliament in shaping policy. And I would say without further ado, let's hear from Barbara Haering herself about the infinite loop. Thank you all for being here.
Well, Indira, Simon, thank you for your introduction, and thank you for making this evening happening, and for giving me the opportunity, so to say, to sort out some reflections. I'm sometimes also struggling because Switzerland is such a complex country, as India, as all our countries. So you gave me the opportunity to prepare this presentation and this talk, and so to sort out my own thoughts, and I'm happy to be here and to share them with you. I will first try to set the scene and to ask some questions, the questions I'm asking myself in my daily work. I will then go into science on the one hand and politics on the other hand, so to say, to go into these systems and see how they work and how we could eventually work at the interface of these two systems. Then I would like to share the lessons I learned and I'm still learning while consulting public administrations and universities in their strategy development. And we will have a brief outlook where I would like to look beyond just science and politics. So let me set the scene with the discussion of science and politics during the COVID pandemic. And I searched the web for some articles, some titles, and it was interesting to see that you had the same discussions here in India as we had in Switzerland, as they were in Germany. One of the renowned experts in Switzerland criticized the Swiss government and stepped back from the task force at a very early stage. He said, these politicians, they just don't get a clue of what I'm saying. They don't see the puck, as we would say in Swiss German. So he stepped back at a very early stage. You can see in India also, the scientists were not happy. They had the impression that while the COVID wave neared, politics overrode their scientific advice. And you have exactly the same thing in Germany, where the renowned Professor Droste, who was on the TV every evening during COVID, also stepped back from the task force with a lot of criticism with regards to politics. And at the end, I found the quote of your Nobel Prize winner who said there needs to be a barrier between science and politics. So these are a couple of quotes, and they all address the situation regarding the COVID pandemic, which hit our countries unexpectedly and without preparation. And I realized that every country was struggling somehow in the same way, be it a highly developed country, be it a less developed country. It doesn't matter. We were hit and didn't know how to react properly. I could have the same setting seen with regards to digital health, where researchers are urgently asking to get data, to be innovative with regards to the development of new pharmaceutics. And politics say, well, no, but there's data protection and we don't have, and we don't even have a digital and electronic patient dossier in Switzerland. So same discussion also when it comes to cybersecurity, where in Switzerland the ETH domain was really pushing hard for years to get something done within the federal administration regarding risk of cybersecurity. And at the end, on the political level, it was a discussion about in which department should that new office be. And that was, at the end, the political discussion, and the researchers were just fed up with waiting until something happened. It, at the end, was then established in the Defense Department. Climate change would be the last example I would mention, where we have this gap between what science and researchers are telling and how politics is acting. So the questions are, is there a fundamental misunderstanding? Is there actually missing mutual interest? Is it just a lack of experience in working together? And how could we move forward? And I would like to look for answers for these questions against the background, against my personal background. Actually, I studied environmental studies and physical planning long time ago. I have been active in politics for many years. I'm now on strategic boards on the one hand, consulting public administrations and universities, and doing a little bit of research on vacations, for example. Yeah. So this is my background, and I have been working within these systems, but mainly I'm interested in the interface of these systems and working across these systems. But before we work across, we will have to look at the systems themselves. So how to construct the infinite loop that you found for that title is a very nice title. How to work successfully across the interface of science and politics, and how to explore innovative policy making at that interface. And at the end, I would like to add value to both systems, adding value to the system, to the political system, to democracy, to the people in a country, but also adding value to the academic world. And I think they don't know that they could learn. So adding value also to researchers and to science. But let us first have a look at science, because science in itself is a complex system, of course. It's searching for truth, but it's facing contradictory missions and expectations. First mission is, of course, and I think it's a primary mission of science, seeking for insight with something like a very intrinsic motivation in the spirit of the Enlightenment. Wonderful. Spirit of the Enlightenment, seeking new insights, and pass on this knowledge to young students, to society, to the economic sector, to whomever. That's, so to say, the primary mission of research. Fundamental research also, blue sky research, without a concrete objective and goal, just the interest for insight. And there is, of course, a second mission, and this is really contributing to solutions for real-world problems and acting in favor of society, in favor of the economic sector, in favor of the environment, and that's more the applied science, the, so to say, real-world problem-oriented research. And this part of the mission has become more and more important during the last decades, and more money has also gone into this mission. But there is actually a third mission, and that's where it becomes complicated. I think research and science has to reflect in a critical distance on societal development and has to take a critical positioning also with regards to science, to development in the economic, in the political, in the cultural sector. And actually it's only by somehow transforming these contradictory missions that science adds its really particular value to the world. So we're facing a system that is in itself already complex and in itself already facing contradictory expectations. And now let us move to politics. And that's a completely different world. It's a task of societal optimization, not about truth. Not at all about truth, politics. It's about solutions, real-world solutions that can be applied. Solutions for societal, economic, and environmental challenges, or for general concerns, whatever. These solutions must be capable of winning a majority, be it in parliament, be it in a referendum. So they must be somehow acceptable for a majority in a society. That's not always the truth. That's something which is an optimization of various truths and various interests. And political decisions have to be taken within legal framework conditions. And that's a restriction for many decisions. They have to consider legal framework conditions or create new law. They must respect budget targets, and that's very tough, and use taxpayers' money responsible. I'm interested always in cross-cutting issues. And I think cross-cutting issues are becoming more and more important. But our administrations are structured in a hierarchical way. And so they are never really fit to address these cross-cutting issues. For example, in Switzerland, we were trying to find enough money to participate in the European meteorological satellites, and a couple of departments were interested. The Department of the Environment was, of course, interested. The department responsible for science and economy was interested, and also the foreign ministry was interested. But it was very expensive, but the legal framework conditions said they are not able to put their money together and to pool it to make more out of it. So there are we are facing very strict boundaries in politics to take decisions. And this is a problem because we're facing accentuated change in almost all developments right now. And we are also facing ever faster developing global crisis. We're talking about a perma-crisis, one crisis after the other. And this actually urges politics to deliver solutions on the spot that can be implemented right away. So that's an insight into a system that is very much bound to strict conditions and maybe not really fit for the future. The way we constructed it was fit for the past, but not really fit for the future. And so here the two images you can see, it's on the one hand the Swiss Parliament, the inside of the Swiss Parliament, and of course, you know, the Parliament in Delhi. So if we want to sum up these different logics, I tried to do a table with, on the one hand, the logic within the system, the reference systems, the interests and incentives. They always go hand in hand. The way you send incentives, the interests, the way you foster specific interests. and then a couple of other aspects. And let me summarize it for the academic system first. It's a search for insight when we come to the logic. It's a transfer of knowledge, and it's a lot of competition of ideas, a lot of competition of ideas. You know that what you found today will maybe not be true tomorrow, and a new scientist will come and find out the Earth is round and it's not flat. And then Wegener comes and said, and well, the continents were not there where they are today. And Wegener was rejected with his idea as a professor at the TU Dresden because he said, that's just a crazy guy. And today everybody knows he was right. It took decades to prove why he was right. So it's a lot of competition of ideas. And if we go to politics, it's the search for solutions, a social optimization process, and it's a lot of ideology. So not really competition, but ideology, and the more and more strict ideology in these years. That's what also frightens me. If we look at the reference systems, science has a long-term perspective. Those who work in astrophysics know how long the projects go on. If I look how long it takes in CERN to build up a new beamline and then to do the experiment, it's a whole life of a researcher dedicated to one project. And it's global. From the beginning to the end, it's global. On the other hand, politics is even more short-term than middle and long-term. And it's local, national, and global. The most important decisions are taken on the national level when it comes to politics. This, of course, involves various interests and various incentives. For science, it's the intrinsic motivation on the one hand. It's, of course, also scientific competition. It's academic career and also economic interests. Politicians, on the other hand, they are intrinsic motivated, that's for sure, but they also want to be re-elected. And elections take place every 4 years. As in Switzerland, every 4 years. Here it's, I think, every 5 years. The longer the better, I think. 4 years is very short. You start a legislation period, you already start again with campaigning. United States have every 2nd year election, so it's very short term, and you're always looking and thinking, will I be re-elected or not, and what should I do to be re-elected or not? And linked to this election, it's of course also, that's the positive side, the responsibility regarding your electorate. And then some additional aspects. Of course, science is a system that is still very male-dominated in many disciplines. Some disciplines it has changed, others it's still very male-dominated, and you can feel it. Benchmarks are reflecting also old traditions within science. And some additional aspect regarding politics, it's strongly depending on short-term visibility of the individual parliamentarian. So you see, we have two really completely different systems, and they should work together. They urgently should work together. But there is, of course, a lot of misunderstanding at that interface, since these two systems work so completely different. And constructing the infinite loop, embracing, so to say, science and politics, needs a lot of innovation and a lot also, I would say, something like perseverance and not giving up. So let me share the experience I make in my everyday work of consulting, on the one hand, academic institutions, and on the other hand, public administrations. And the first lesson I learned was you have to acknowledge the differences. You have to acknowledge them and take them seriously. You have to translate and you have to build bridges. So we have seen how these two systems follow different logics. And it's not one system better than the other. If we go back to my first slide, politicians were angry about researchers and researchers were angry about politicians. They didn't accept that both scientists, on the one hand, and politicians, on the other hand, are experts in their specific field. They are experts, and they have to, so to say, meet on the same level. Differences and the specific expertise must be mutually recognized if we want to be successful in working across the interface of science and politics. And this means really translating from one language to the other, constantly trying to, sometimes you use the same word, but you mean completely different things. So you really have to be translating back and forth and building bridges and working on that interface. So that's the first lesson, translation in various languages, actually. And building bridges. Building bridges with two-way systems. So it's not a one-way system, it's a two-way system. It has to go in both ways. And my next lesson regarding, it's a double equation. It's science for politics, and it's politics for science. And the two have to meet in order to be successful. So democracies, and that's where it's not just about politics, but about politics in democratic systems. Politics in democratic systems have high needs of legitimation. You have to legitimate vis-à-vis of the electorate in Switzerland with our system of referendum, where we have to vote every 3 months on a couple of issues. You have to legitimate the project, the political project you're proposing. And so political decisions must be evidence-based. And that's where science and research comes in. There is a constant need for a dialogue of politics and science, and this must somehow be structured in order to be sustainable. You cannot just do it at one time and then give up again and pick it up when you have a next need. It has to be a structured dialogue of politics and science. Actually, the UK has a very nice system for this. They have a chief scientific advisor who reports directly to the Prime Minister. And in every department, in every office, there is, so to say, his colleague with a specific task for that political issue. And together they build a network of integrating scientific knowledge within political decision making. It doesn't always solve all political issues, as we know from the UK. But it's a nice system. And in addition, we have to educate civil society. That's a big task for research, for science, really. And I still have the impression universities forget about this always. Again, they may have it as a slogan on their website, but really doing that constantly, informing and educating civil society is important with regards to political decision making. Media is crucial in communicating scientific findings to a wider public, so to say, to add the real facts to what we see now with the alternative facts or fake facts, fake news. So I think that's a really important task of science with regards to politics. being in a constant dialogue with the decision makers, but also educating and transforming the civil society in order to make them prepared for change. More than ever, because more than ever, politics depends on science and on its contributions to solving social problems. That's why this second mission became so important during the last decade. Actually, when we go back to the COVID pandemic, we realized that there wasn't a constant dialogue between biologists, pharmaceutical, and political decision-making. Actually, nobody was really interested in our countries, in our northern Western countries, in those who did research on pandemics, because we never had a pandemic. Epidemiologists, they were just really working, they did their scientific work maybe for Africa, in collaboration with Africa, in collaboration with South America or with India, but not with Europe. And so both sides first had to get to know each other somehow, and to get to work together and to learn and respect the specific responsibilities of these two different systems in order to be successful. And now, actually, the task force is still there and has been renewed and will also continue to work beyond the actual pandemic, because we realized that this dialogue has to be a constant one if it should work in a situation, in a crisis situation. And so the other part of the equation, politics for science, this dialogue has the potential to add value to both systems. Politics must assure stable framework conditions for science, including stable budgets. And actually, the stability is almost more important than the level, because stop and go really doesn't function in science. If you launch a long-term project, you have to be able to carry it through throughout a lot of years. And I figured out that just as we speak, Switzerland is now reducing the budget for science because of budgetary constraints. And I think the same happened in India also during the last years. It did not increase, although we need more science to solve our future problems. Autonomy, that is an important issue as well. Actually, it's politics that has to guarantee the autonomy of research. So it's not a barrier. I would not like to see a barrier between politics and research, but it's a task of politics to assure the autonomy of academic institutions. It's pivotal when it comes to assuring the fundamental freedom of research and teaching. And let me add a third element, real world. Working on real world problems, working with political decision makers can help science to grasp real world problems and to transform them into interesting research questions. So they have something to benefit from being exposed to real world issues and to public debates. They themselves can benefit of that because the questions are out there and they can grasp them. So science depends on a strong public commitment, even if third-party money is becoming important for universities, because private funding is important but will never assure long-term research. That's always short-term, applied, objective-oriented. So both systems need respect and autonomy, but there should be no barrier. In the contrary, they should have a constant contact and dialogue. Actually, independent strategy boards of academic institutions, like the boards I'm on or chairing, have a very important function at that interface of the academic institutions and the political system on the other hand. And at the same time, universities, they must somehow teach and support their researchers in communicating, because it's not given that a researcher has this ability to talk to the public, although it's an important task for him or her. So universities should support and train their researchers in doing so. And I would like to add, in my next lesson learned, a third party player, and that's the public administration. Actually, often we just complain about public administrations. They are too slow, they are too complicated, too bureaucratic. But actually, they have very broad competencies. They have very broad competencies, scientific, process-related, and political competencies. And it's particularly the middle level of public administrations where they still have the knowledge of their scientific background, where they come from, but they already have learned how the machine works. I think that's the important and the innovative part, and that's the part I would like to strengthen with my support. And moreover, public administrations usually serve as institutional memory, because politics goes up and down and up and down. One issue is on top on the agenda. 3 months later, it's already forgotten and a new story has come up, but the administration will still follow up what is happening. So even though I'm often frustrated with how public administrations work, I think they are a very important interface between science and politics, and we should take care of them and foster them. They have an innovation potential that is not yet really used, and also not really strengthened and let go. So these were actually my lessons learned, and in my third part, I would just like to look a little bit beyond the equation of science and politics and add two more systems to make it more complex but also more interesting. I would like to add economy, and I would like to add art as players in this system of this infinite loop. Science and economy, during the last century, this nexus of science and economy has become very strong. It has become increasingly important. Fostering innovation through scientific and technological findings is of strategic importance for our economies in a globally competitive world. And some countries here, I realize in India, I'm experiencing a completely different dynamic, much more dynamic ecosystem of spin-offs, of enterprises, of launching a project and starting to do it and looking what it happens. In Switzerland, you would first do a preliminary study, then you would do a feasibility study, and then you would have a decision-making process, and then you would build up the organization to implement it, and you would start a pilot phase, and then you would have to have an evaluation. And at the end, you may say, well, we have to change the project, because new questions arise. And I have the impression here in India, you would much rather start the project and look what it contributes. And if it's not perfect, you just change it and adapt it. And that's what I experience here. And that's an important take-back message and lesson learned for me to take back to Switzerland. And I would like to add art to this discussion, because actually science and art were linked ever since. and the ties only got weaker during the last the last centuries. And embracing the interaction of art and science may even foster understanding and cooperation of the other players, of research, politics, and the economy. And maybe that's how we will come to the infinite loop. It's not just science and politics, but adding the economic sector with its entrepreneurial thinking and art with its reflection. Because ultimately, they all work systematically with their own systematic approaches, but they all also work with a lot of intuition. And bringing that together could really add value for all of us. I'd just like to show you some impressions I had from the Kochi Musiris Biennale we visited 2 weeks ago. On the one hand, a project, it's somehow an archive presenting the empowerment, the development of empowerment of women in Nepal, but it's also an art project, and it's a continuous project that is further developed from one year to the other, adding new developments and archiving it and disposing it in a very beautiful and artistic way. And on the other hand, a quote I found there, a very old quote actually. It goes, "The gift of a useful plant seems to me more precious than the discovery of a gold mine and a more durable momentum than a pyramid." And it has been written in 1773. So, to end up with the infinite loop, a brief summary of my reflections, acknowledging the rationale of the other side, translating and building bridges, maintaining a constant and structured dialogue, building up networks that assure this structured dialogue, assuring stable framework conditions for science, introducing strategy boards as mediators, supporting researchers to communicate with the broader public, activating the innovative power of public administration, it's a potential, and adding art and the economy to the equation. Thank you.
Yes, so Barbara will take questions, and while everything is being set up, I just want to say a sort of a preliminary thank you. We'll probably say thank you at the end too. But you see that this a quiet, elegant person in a fabulous Anokhi kurta is just a powerhouse, really. That's what you are. Thinking about ways in which to change, innovate, and bring change. So anyone who wants to take a question, please come to the mic. Yeah.
So my name is Swami Subramaniam. I work for a philanthropic organization that funds science in India, in the life science community. I'm just going to very quickly run through 3 points. I'm not expecting answers, but I certainly would like your comments. One is, if you think about fundamental science or blue sky science or basic science, it is very similar to art. It is the creation of something new. Although science is expected to be useful, blue sky science is not always starting with that expectation. So if the government of country should fund science, should they also be funding the production of art? So, I mean, that's kind of I'm not expecting an answer, it's rhetorical. The reason I ask that is, the reason why governments do not fund science is because they don't understand its utility. Basic science, right? I mean, they don't make a strong connection between funding basic science and getting an economic output out of it. So I have been struggling to find papers on how countries have benefited economically or in some material manner by funding basic science. And there is very little literature because it's very hard to make that connection. So I think that's a fundamental problem why bureaucrats and politicians, quite rightfully from their perspective, They don't see when there is a child starving on the street, why would I fund a large hadron collider? Yeah. So I would rather fund the child starving on the street. So that's, I think, a reasonable stance to take. The other thing about, so that's really the two cultures problem of politicians and bureaucrats not understanding the purpose of science. The other thing is about basic versus applied science. The Indian government has been very good at funding mission-oriented science. And I think to some extent, success in mission-oriented science will eventually drive funding of basic science, because like the United States, they funded science during the war mainly for military purposes. But then they realized that was actually had civilian applications. The space program in the US resulted in a big expansion of scientific funding. So I think India's at the stage of funding science and defense, and maybe we will then realize that we cannot continue doing that unless we have a good basic science platform. And the final two comments, there is something called the quantity of science, which means how much should a country spend. And I think percentage of GDP is a very poor metric of how much money we should put into science. Because percentage of GDP of a country like China or Switzerland or India is vastly different. But the space of science is the same for all the countries. And the final remark is quality of science. I think scientists do not give enough attention to paying attention to the quality of science that they produce. I mean, there are, apart from the fact that a lot of science is not robust enough to be replicated, but there is also fraud and all other kinds of things going on in science. And unless scientists address that at a very basic, fundamental level, they are not going to be trusted as investment vehicles for growth. I will
thank you for your
respond to any of that.
Yeah. Actually, the first point you mentioned is one of our big concerns in the ETH, on the board of the ETH domain. And I always say we have to be able to explain to a farmer up in, and I always use the example of the Murtatal, it's a very small valley, how to explain to a farmer that we have to invest so much money into CERN, into this kind of research, or into the PSI, Paul Scherrer Institute with the Swiss Light Source. That's our task as a strategic board, to be able to explain that even the applied science we need today has its basis in the fundamental research of yesterday. And actually the big changes come from the fundamental research. And that's a constant fight, because if you're elected every 4 years, it's much easier to fund mission-oriented applied science, because there you will be able to show the impact already maybe in 3 or in 4 years. And it's always much easier to get fresh money for science if it's for mission-oriented than for basic. So that is really one of the big tasks and challenges for strategic boards, to explain the importance of fundamental research. And when it comes to funding art, actually in Switzerland, on all 3 levels of our state, on city level, cantonal, local level, cantonal level, and national level, production of art is subsidized, and there are projects and funds you can apply for projects. So that has increased during the last, I would say, 15 years with a message, with a dispatch every 4 years, also on the national level, with clear ambition of strengthening also the production of art in Switzerland. Thank you for your reflection.
Thank you for such a thought-provoking talk. My name is Kritika, and I completely echo your point about ensuring that institutions that practice science or create science,
Again?
The institutions, the academic institutions where science is practiced or science is created or discovered or invented, need to be autonomous. But my question is, do you think these institutions and labs need to work within a framework of first principles that are informed by, say, basic principles of democracy? Or how do you see this, because we sadly see this, varying trend of democracy is declining. So in that sense, do you think science regulation and can benefit from some understandings of what...
I thought of that when you told me that you were studying in Vienna at the Central European University, the university that had to leave Budapest for political reasons. And that's why I really stress, I think it's a task of democracy to assure stable conditions and autonomy to the university system, because otherwise, on the long term, they will not be able to deliver their potential, what they can. It's fundamental, a task of democracy to assure this autonomy and their freedom of research and of teaching, both. Yeah. Yeah.
Thank you very much for your presentation. You've given us a lot to think about. I just wanted to mention that in India as well, you mentioned the UK. In India as well, we have the system of the chief scientific advisor or principal scientific advisor. And my question is actually not to you, but in a way addressed to the academics and the scientists in the audience. I want to know how effective they think that this system has been, and has it benefited the scientific institutions? Has it benefited entrepreneurs? How has it functioned in India? And if anybody would like to take that question, I'd be very happy.
I think the scientific, the chief scientific advisor and his network within the administration should first of all be of benefit for the decision making. So there will only be an indirect impact on the economic system and beyond.
I agree,
Yeah.
but in this case, in India's case also, the chief scientific advisor reports directly to the Prime Minister. So it is specifically geared at giving political advice to the
Yeah.
Prime Minister.
Yeah.
But I'm just interested in knowing how accessible the person is, and what has been the experience of people who, say, for instance, have startups or need some cooperation from the government. What have they been able to get from this institution?
Anyone? What is your experience? Actually, in Switzerland, we have a system where we have one institution, and it's called InnoSwiss. And InnoSwiss is there to support innovation that goes to spin-offs, to small and medium-sized companies, but also to large companies. But Switzerland is very strict in not supporting the companies directly financially. It's the only country in Europe where there is a clear barrier. The funding from the Swiss government would only go to the research institute that supports the company, but not to the company itself. Yeah.
I'm sure there are people in this room who know more about this topic, but I will take a shot. Hopefully they will be provoked to come and give their comments. This is about the principal scientific advisor in India. This is a political appointee who reports directly to the Prime Minister. I think the influence of the PSA on the Prime Minister is a function of two things: how open the Prime Minister is to listen, and the ideological stance of the Prime Minister with respect to science and everything that happens in the country. So the effect, and because this is a political appointee and he will lose his job if he's not kind of towing the line on many things, unpopular things cannot possibly be said or implemented. But things like the standard things that you would do in terms of implementing efficiency or starting up a new institute, I'm sure the PSA can have some impact on that. I know that the scientific community in India was disappointed with the previous PSA, but the previous PSA in his defense said that the way he would survive and have a positive impact and not have a very poor caliber person have that role after him was to actually play a role that was kind of subdued, but behind the scenes. So that's what I know. And if there is somebody in the audience who knows more than I about this, I'm happy to hear.
Thank you. So I'm also learning from this discussion.
Hi, Barbara.
Hi.
I'm Sandeep. Thank you very much for a very well-researched presentation that you made and emphasizing on the topic of communication and also bringing the fields together. I've been working with people and working on more of communication area with the masses and developing consciousness so that we can bring mass level shifts. My question is that you brought this idea of educating civil society, you brought economics, art, and science. However, there is one area I noticed make a huge difference. The government is funded, or when the government wants to win the election, they are funded by certain corporates. And the corporates are also expecting the policies in their favor. They play a significant role when it comes to making decisions by the government. Now, even if scientific advisors are presenting some solutions which are in benefit of the masses or the public, the government may not be able to take the decision unless the corporations also find it to be in their favor. One, for example, is a few years ago it was discovered that the RO, reverse osmosis systems, are not good for the water which is consumed by the public because they remove the minerals from the water. The scientists presented it to the government, but the lobby of purifier makers, water purifier makers, did not let this proposal be made into a law to change the system because they have invested greatly on developing these kind of water purifiers. And this happens again and again in different ways. So I wonder if this is something which you have developed concern for, or how do you consider addressing or not addressing, whatever, how you feel about it. Thank you.
At the end, it's a power play, huh? You would say. Since in Switzerland all laws have to pass, or almost all laws have to pass a referendum, you have to integrate different interests already before you present something to the parliament. So a lot of this pressure and in dialogue or quarrels regarding different interests takes place already before a project is presented to the parliament. And in that phase, actually, the administration in Switzerland is very important because it's the administration that is, so to say, organizing these dialogues and these also power plays before a project is presented to Parliament. That's why I'm paying attention to this important player of the public administration in doing that correctly. But at the end, it's of course a difficult equation with a lot of power play. And educating the civil society will help that interest become stronger. The interest also of the not-haves and not only the interest of the haves. Yeah.
Hi, thank you so much for the session. This is Sudha. So I wanted to ask you around, you're speaking about the 4 or 5 years of tenure that exists. So you're saying that 4 years is, you still feel that, it's very small. Here, considering it's 5, right? So many of the projects are things that seem to be important, generally start here towards the end of their tenure. And they never, go further. And, new people come in and new stuff starts. And how is it in a parallel universe or whatever, what do you think is an alternative, to ensure that, there is a prolonged, continuity for the educational and scientific projects that are happening? So this also comes from, for example, our civil servants pass some of the toughest exams in India. In the world, it's considered as some of the toughest exams. They study economics, politics, science, and whatnot, everything that's out there. And, they secure these jobs. And at the end of the day, they are just puppets, and the final decisions are in the hands of mostly illiterate or uneducated politicians that is happening in India. So I'm very sorry to say this. So what do you think? Like, how is it going to be there? And I just have another question. So you're saying, during the differences that you're speaking about, in the science and the other thing. So you're saying that science is still, majorly male-dominated. So when you say that, so are you saying that, more of female representation would add in a lot of empathy and compassion, which are generally considered as, natural female traits, or are you coming from another perspective? That's it from me.
I didn't get the second question. Could you add it again?
So the second question was, you are saying science is still majorly male-dominated. So are you saying that, adding more of, where is it coming from? I'll try to keep it simple. So when you say it's male-dominated, for example, if you need more of a female representation, are you saying that, natural traits of women, which are like compassion and empathy, that will come into place and add different kind of value to the thing? Or is it coming from a different, area or perspective?
Actually, we've seen in a couple of disciplines the male domination going down. For example, in medicine. The majority are now females in Europe. I don't know how it is in India. In law also, it has been changing, but it's not really changing in the hardcore, in engineering and in maths. And what I realized and what we realized also in the ETH domain is if you have a very technical subject, like engineering, and you add a purpose to it, like healthcare or like environment, women will go for it. We started, and we had first in the ETH domain, we just had natural sciences. We added and enlarged the question to environmental and social questions, and the quota of women went up immediately. We built up a new curriculum on, it's called Health and Technology, Health and Engineering. It's a very tough technical engineering curriculum, but because it's focused on health and on health care, women go for it. It's like women have to have an additional purpose why engineering should be important, and then they will go for it, also if it's very technical. And let me add one additional experience where we made MINT, so the mathematics, engineering, and natural sciences are also fields where we have a lot of second generation people coming, so it's also a field, a way of strengthening, of weakening social disparities and of letting people grow within the society. So we somehow slowly know how to get women into engineering and technical fields. Now we still have to encourage them to take over responsibilities when it comes to university governance, and there we need special programs also supporting women in taking over their first responsibilities and coaching them through their first responsibilities to make this a good experience and to give them the confidence to run for office, also for other things. Yeah. And with regards to the duration of an election period, I just think that 4 years, when you have new people coming in, it takes a year to get accustomed to the mechanisms of parliament and of political work at that level. And then you have maybe 2 years where you can be productive, and then in the last year you're already preparing your next election. So I think switching from 4 to 5 years will enlarge these 2 years where you can be productive to 3 years. France has it also. It's also a 5 years system.
Hi, yeah, I'm Vijay Chandru. I'm a professor at the Indian Institute of Science, and you know, you started out by talking about the tensions during COVID, and so I just wanted to first make a comment and then ask a question. I think the comment actually relates to what Lata and Swami talked about. I think, you know, as far as the principal scientific advisor and
Task
his
forces.
role, you know, during the pandemic, and also other scientific leadership like Dr. Soumya Swaminathan, who, you know, was serving as the chief scientist of WHO. I think there was constant communication from the science community to them, and I think they were interpreting and you know, passing the information on to the political leadership in the way that they could. And so you know, I think they were listening and helping in the communication, bridging the communication. How effective that was, I think, you know, there's lots of issues to be judged, and so my personal experience was, and I was involved in a lot of the COVID management side of things. So it was you know, very effective to be able to communicate through them. I think my question to you was, how did it all actually work out in Switzerland? I think it would just be interesting for us to understand how this play between science and politics happened during the pandemic.
COVID.
During the pandemic, and how that worked out. Right. Thank you.
Actually, in the beginning, it was just the office that is responsible, the health office, that was managing it, and they actually had a commission on epidemics, but that commission never really got active. They very soon introduced a scientific task force, and then it was always like on Sundays, first information would leak in the newspapers, so that politicians could, so to say, feel how the public would react on something. And then on Tuesday, the scientific task force would take its stand and give its advice, and on Wednesday, the government would take the decisions. We actually in Switzerland had a rather, so the government always took into account the scientific advice, but also the echo of the public that they had heard, because they deliberately let things leak on Sunday to get some feeling about how a decision could be acceptable or not. Actually, in Switzerland, I must say we had a very liberal approach to the pandemic. Our lockdown was not very strict, and we were, of course, fortunate to be a rich country that could afford to buy first-hand vaccines, and a lot of people got vaccinated. But there was, of course, a group, and still is a group, that is against vaccination. But and they launched initiatives, and we had to vote on, and they launched referendums. So there was a very lively political debate on the measures that were taken. The measures were in so to say, in a law, and this law was put to a referendum and was strongly supported by the voters in two. We had two referendums on the measures taken by the government. So Switzerland, the combination of having a liberal approach with regards to lockdowns and a lot of money to afford vaccination. We had the vaccines immediately when they were on the market, and so we got through quite easily. Of course, companies were affected, and there the fact that we are a rich country has been beneficial in addition, because the state subsidized a lot of companies that were directly affected by the measures taken by the government. For example, all theaters, all cultural institutions, all restaurants, all the industries that were directly affected by the lockdown had the right to ask for subsidies and got subsidies for once, without any bureaucratic barriers. It was misused in some cases, but that's another story and not so important for that time. Mm-hmm.
Thank you very much for your talk. It was very thought-provoking. I had 2 questions. One, if you could give us a bit of an insight into your time as a member of parliament, what it was like for a scientist to sort of be chairing committees and working and interacting with politicians. Did it require you to change your mindset or think differently? My second question is about the role that education can play in building these. The role that education can play in building these bridges. You spoke of the interaction between science and economy, science and art, science and politics, but in our education system here in India, we end up being very specialized. We either become entirely interested in arts and humanities or in sciences, and it's very difficult to bridge those mindsets later on in life because one is so severely specialized. I'm curious to know if it's different in Switzerland and if the education system breaks past those barriers, and do you think that education can play a role in making those sorts of interactions, those sorts of bridges more possible? Mm-hmm. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for your first question. Actually, maybe this made me also leave Parliament after 17 years. The fact that, because I found out that I was not able anymore to give very short quotes, because I knew the questions were more complicated than just these 18-second quotes that you can give for a TV news. And it certainly, I chaired as well, I chaired the Science and Education and Culture Committee, and I also chaired the Defense Committee. So these 2 committees are rather evidence-based. You do science and education is evidence-based, but actually security politics is also quite structured and evidence-based. So maybe I also choose the subjects according to my background, and it definitely supported me when I got the impression, okay, it's time to move on and to leave Parliament. So that's for your first question. And for the second one, I think these silos exist also in our countries, everywhere. And I think it's a long story, really, since the Enlightenment, where the scientific branch and the arts developed in different ways. And I'm always interested in the interfaces, because I guess the questions we will have to solve in future are cross-cutting these issues, and we have to, on the one hand, be a specialist in one field to be solid in where we come from and where we have our legitimation also, but we have to reach out to other disciplines and try to understand their language and to work together to make synergies and to ultimately solve cross-cutting issues. Yeah. So I would follow your advice also. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you so much for that very insightful session, ma'am. I had 2 questions. One's a little more general question, one's a little more specific. The first question is, so there's one point of commonality between the political system and the scientific system. That is the media, right? So
that is?
The media. Media visibility helps.
Yeah.
I'm so sorry, yes. So media visibility helps with elections, media visibility helps with grants. What is the role of the media in the interface between science and politics? My second one's a little more specific. So since you have a background in urban policymaking and urban planning, COVID, especially in India's densely populated cities, showed us a lot of the failure points of urban policymaking here domestically. Is there a similar experience for that in Europe? Would you care to elaborate on that?
Actually, about 10 years, 15 years, 20 years ago, there was a lively community of journalists working at the interface of science and publishing facts. And this has, since all the, with all the social media, information is becoming shorter and shorter. This community was under pressure and has diminished, at least in Switzerland. And I think that's a pity, because it takes more than just a Twitter sentence to explain a scientific finding. And it's a real piece of art to transport scientific findings in a way that a broad public would understand it. And it would be so important to work and to do that. And maybe art can help us. And I saw a couple of projects, also one project on how species and biodiversity diminishes. It was a project of an artist with a scientist in Switzerland about biodiversity in the mountains, in the Alps and in the Himalayas. And it was produced as an art piece in Kochi. So that kind of thing can help us understand scientific findings. And regarding your last question, I think we have not yet learned all the lessons from COVID for city planning and urban development. I think it will be much more decentralized again, because people start working from home. People don't want to commute anymore, but that urban planning, you know, as a professional, it takes a long time until you change again. But I would go into a much more decentralized structure with hubs and with co-working spaces in different areas, also to reduce mobility. And I think that could be a lesson learned from COVID. Mm-hmm.
Thank you so much for patiently responding to all of our questions. Mm-hmm. My name is Champaka Rajagopal. I am an urban planning / urban policy professional. I teach at Azim Premji University here, and I also teach at Sciences Po, at the urban school at Sciences Po in Paris. Recently, I've started the Entrepreneurship and Partnerships Lab, which focuses on mechanism design. And it very much speaks to many of the challenges that you highlighted in terms of bringing together institutions that are, or systems that are misaligned in their values and goals. Mm-hmm. And you've highlighted very importantly the space of dialogue. And it's been quite impossible to strike conversations, for instance, between states and businesses that are misaligned in their values and goals when public-private partnerships, for instance, have to come together. And my lab works on partnership arrangements between parties that are misaligned in their values and goals. So I wanted to seek your thoughts on any entry points you would suggest may work to strike these dialogues. Mm-hmm. Please, thank you.
Thank you. And I just wrote down one word which I think is very important and which I missed in my presentation. It's the question of values. I think the question of values will become more important, working together towards same values. I think we right now have common challenges that make us work together. And working together also for new values together will be an additional step, and that would be wonderful. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you for the wonderful lecture. It was very enlightening. You said like when you have to ask for grants for scientific communities and projects, you have to act as we're explaining it to a farmer in a valley somewhere. In the recent years and biology, chemistry and epidemic control and all, they got very big grants from the politics and government because of COVID. So how would you suggest other fields of sciences like physics, astrophysics and all, how would they go about asking for grants and all?
I think that's where they need a mediator and somebody who supports them and who can explain to what extent long-term fundamental research will be important for the next generation, because that's an intergenerational interest. And that is not as easy as just supporting, subsidizing research done for agriculture, which has a much faster return on investment than long-term physics. That is really a challenge where we all have to work together on our strategic boards to convince politicians that we need that, not for today, but for tomorrow and for the next year. Thank you.
All right, we are nearing the conclusion. I'm going to take the liberty of asking the closing question. And that is, you've mentioned as an example with the UK, with the Chief Scientific Advisor, you've mentioned how you're inspired by the entrepreneurial spirit that you've experienced here in India. And I wonder if you can give us examples of specific individuals within the scientific community, within the policy community, and maybe the public administration also, that are sources of inspiration, and what makes them sources of inspiration to you?
Here in India or in Switzerland?
In your experience, anywhere on Earth.
My husband, as a researcher. I think it's always when people are able to bridge over from one discipline to the other that I'm inspired, and that people let me understand what they are doing in their different field. That inspires me. And that can be on every level, be it on a grassroots level or be it on a top-notch scientific level. If people go beyond their silos and try to address cross-cutting issues, then I'm feeling inspired. Thank you.
I think there's no better way to conclude than with some words of inspiration. And with that, we want to say a big thank you to Barbara Haering for sharing her insights and experience with us this evening.